Good. We're here with Valerie Ziegler, who's teaches at the Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco Unified School District, a history teacher there. Valerie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Valerie, the school year started. You're teaching some economics classes and some U.S. history classes. Where are you planning on slotting the Civic online reasoning materials into your curriculum this year?
Sure. Well, with my U.S. history classes, I always start the year with the basics of historical thinking. And so I begin with the Stanford Reading Like a Historian curriculum right off the bat with sourcing. And so, I always begin with that Thanksgiving image and really start it from there. And then
and the Thanksgiving image is a image that's a relatively contemporary image that people think is a depiction of the past, but it's actually sort of a contemporary interpretation of the past.
Yeah, the image is from the early 1930s, and so, but it represents, a much more, over 200 years before. And so we begin with that. Overwhelmingly, students trust the image because it looks like what they know of Thanksgiving. And so that's a real starting point. This is consistent every year. Students always trust that image. And so it's a great place to start. And then from there, we get into the ideas of sourcing. And I start with, with some of those lessons that, just historical thinking and thinking about how we source. And then I move into weaving in images. And thinking about how we trust images. And every year I try to find an image that is in the news that they might have seen or on social media that they might have seen. So a few years ago, there was an image about Charlottesville that had been widely reported that it was about Charlottesville. It had a little boy with a KKK hood. It wasn't from then, it was from much earlier, but it had been circulated in that time period. So I always try to find something. And this year coming into an election, there have been a lot of images that students assume are real and that they're from that time period. So that's usually my starting out point. With my economics class, that course also becomes a politics class. And so I frame it in the same way, really thinking about what are our current events and what are we thinking about as we enter that class. So, the great thing about the Civic Online Reasoning curriculum is that it's so relevant. When we're on digital learning, unfortunately, kids are also looking at their phones, a lot more on their screen time. And so it's a really easy grabber for students to gravitate towards images. It's so accessible.
So images is your starting point. How can you find new images that you think will spark interesting conversations? So as a new class starts each year, what do you do when you're going online to find images that will spark interesting conversations?
It's interesting. A lot of times, students will come to you with an image or they'll discuss it, where we're in person. You'll see people looking at an image and debating it. And I know that in the spring, after we had done all of this curriculum, students came to me with images about what they thought about that were COVID-19 or they were being spread about that. And they were accepting them and it was blowing my mind. I said, but we had spent all this time talking about how we analyze and how we reverse source. And, other students said, yeah, we've done this. Why do you accept that? So oftentimes it comes from students. Another way that I will look at it is, honestly, I look at, websites like Snoops, and I look at what are people starting to fact check and what are these images that are being circulated. I'm also really lucky to be a member of a lot of teacher discussion boards. And teachers will often put out images on the discussion boards and say, this is a great place, this is a great image to discuss, or this is somewhere to start. And so, yeah.
Those are three great suggestions. So finding what students bring to you that they're confused or having trouble with, they're getting duped by, going to fact-checking sites like Snopes.com and looking for sources there, and then just being in conversation with other colleagues, who are addressing these same kinds of issues. When a student comes to you and they've misinterpreted an image, can you tell us a little bit about what you do in those circumstances, how you debug those challenges, how you, do you mostly question people? What kinds of reteaching do you do? How do you walk people through things?
I think it definitely depends on the context of how the student brings that image to you. If they bring it to you an image, where you're having a one-on-one conversation, they said, have you seen this? Then usually for me, we discuss it. And then that usually triggers for me, okay, so if this student's thinking this, there's a good chance that a lot of other students are having that thought. And so that becomes a discussion point for me to come back and circle back. And I can give you an example. Most recently, we were analyzing images of the March on Washington, and then I was showing them images, live feed from CNN just last Friday, and it was the anniversary. And then I saw some images that were circulating, and there was this question about the validity. And I thought, okay, kids have these questions. Let's circle back on Monday and really look into that more deeply. if it comes to the full class discussion and, and someone were to bring forth a question, you have to be sensitive to kids that, if they believed something, there might be reasons that they believed that, it might have been something that was told to them from their parents or, so usually that's something that I will bring back with a different image or bring back that skill again, to not, as the kids would say, put that student on blast in front of everybody, but it is always a discussion point. I think we'd be naive to say that all of us haven't fallen for some sort of image or we've looked at it too quickly and thought. And so I think it's also framing that way. And I usually share with students, as someone who teaches environmental issues, I'll say, there's so many issues or images related to climate change. And, I saw one in the beginning of the coronavirus that was like, look at all the things that are thriving because humans are gone. They weren't real, but you see it and you think because you want to believe, and so we have that discussion about how, our confirmation bias can also really guide that. And I share, like, I thought this was real and I was really happy about it. And then I looked into it and I was kind of disappointed that it wasn't. And so I think also expressing to students that this is something that even adults have to constantly use as a skill.
Right, that none of us are immune to these efforts of disinformation. But those are some great tips. So it sounds like one baseline thing you have going on is just whenever you feel like you've encountered a scenario when you were kind of duped or weren't using these civic online reasoning skills as fluently as you'd want to, you can bring those examples and say, hey, look, here are some ways that I'm being challenged. And then it sounds like in some circumstances, if you feel like a student would be safe with it, either because you're in a small group or it's just kind of the right kid in the right context, you might take an error they make and sort of walk through how you would debug that error, the steps you would take. And then it sounds like another strategy that you have is if you don't want to put a particular kid on blast, you'll just find an analogous example and find a reasonable time in the next day or two to sort of reteach that analogous example and be like, hey, let's just do a reminder of how we do these kinds of skills.
I would also say, for a lot of us that are in an online context, we're teaching through a computer. And so, we have the opportunity to use the computer for that purpose. So, I did an example, our lesson and sort of a warm up last year with students when I put them onto breakout groups and said, find me some images about this topic. What are you seeing? And we were specifically looking at coronavirus. And the kinds of things that came back they were all over the place. And so it was just fascinating to start fact checking those and just really start looking. And I think there was something empowering for students to also do the work and find these and look them up and say, wow, I would have never known that wasn't true.
Great. And I think one of the ways that you're sort of narrowing this exercise, again, anchoring it on images. So you're not saying, go find anything you can find about the coronavirus. You're saying, let's just find pictures. And one could imagine also saying, let's just find some videos. Let's just find some data. And focus, use that as a way to focus and have everybody be working on the same kinds of things, but also then be able to say, okay, when we deal with images, the reverse image search is one of our go-to things, even though we're still ask questions about sources, and we'll still be attentive to this idea that images always strike us as incredibly real and have a sort of persuasive power that's different from words, and sort of going back to some of those key themes.
Yeah, and I think, I'm lucky enough in many cases I loop with the same students, so I can build up these skills over time. Not everyone has that opportunity, but you can, images being the entry because students are so invested in that and that's what they're used to, but then you can lead it into videos. It's a little harder to fact check that. But I've started doing a little work with, especially my seniors, really looking at these videos that are considered deep fakes. Mm-hmm. And the most famous that, I had heard a piece about on NPR that was a deep fake Nixon video
right.
about the space program, and so you show that
where people use artificial intelligence to make a video where it appears as if Richard Nixon is saying things, but it's actually a computer manipulated image and sound of Richard Nixon saying things.
And there is no question in kids that is real. Mm-hmm. How would you fake a video, right? And so then, that sort of leads, down that path of like, how do we analyze this and how do we question this? How do we know where it was? And there's some great lessons on the civic online reasoning as well about, like, are these videos, there's just little tricks that we automatically think something is real. So for example, if it looks like it came from an iPhone, then we think, well, that must be real. They couldn't fake that. Mm-hmm. And so it's really trying to get students to use those skills.
As you've worked with students now for, in some cases, a couple of years working on this last year and this year, what are some of the challenges that your students have, or what are some of the misconceptions that they're most likely to come into your courses with?
The biggest challenge is students say, Miss, I can't do this with everything I look at. you know, and they're right, you know. And so, you know, what I always say to them, look, if you're scrolling through food images on Instagram or you're looking at shoes, scroll to your heart's desire. But I
Believe
think,
the shoes.
right, you know, if you're a sneaker, just do it. But I think, you know, what I always tell them, I said, there's two circumstances where you really want to assess this. Are you sharing something and saying that this is fact and this is true? Because then if you are, then you need to go through these steps, right?
Mhm.
If you're, or, you know, if you're sharing that, or if you're putting that out there, or if it's, you know, influencing you to make decisions or choices, then you need to be more careful. If it influences you to buy food, whatever, that's different. But if it influences maybe how you vote on something, then that matters. And so, you know, trying to get through that, because it can feel really overwhelming, to try to do this really laborious work in some cases of really fact checking and image searching. So I think that's one of the challenges in this, is really presenting it to students, is this is what we do sort of in high level. Misconceptions, there sometimes becomes a point in the semester where students will say, well, I know now that I shouldn't trust this because everything she gives us is gonna be fake. And so what I also appreciate is that there's many of the lessons on there where it's real, right? And that those, if you do the fact checking, and I think you have to present that, otherwise you're gonna go down, well, we know that she wants it to be fake, so I'm gonna figure out why it's fake. And that wouldn't be the case if we were doing these skills outside of the classroom.
Good. So because you're teaching these things in context, you're trying to ask people to evaluate, you know, things that seem reasonable but are untrue, and things that seem unreasonable but are in fact true, and making sure that there's sort of a balanced diet of those challenges, so that people don't develop, you know, a too universal skepticism, that also
Yeah.
makes them believe. We don't want them to believe that everything on the internet is fake either. It's sort of guiding them towards that right balance.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, an example is there's a lesson with a tweet that shows, I think it's LeBron James wearing a shirt, and that was a real photo, just what was on the shirt's changed,
Hmm.
right? And so, you know, I think there's another lesson that's similar where just a little thing is tweaked or changed. And so, you know, you really have to put that yes, that happened, and then someone doctored it, right? And so thinking about that way.
If you had new teachers who are beginning to adopt the Civic online reasoning curriculum and start working it into their teaching in their curriculum, what advice would you have for them as they were getting started?
I think it depends on the course that you're teaching, because, you know, this, let's be honest, this could be a whole semester, especially for high
Hmm.
school. Really, you could just work on this all the time. So I think it really does depend on the context of the course, and in some cases, the context of the grade level. You know, if I were doing this in a science class and I do this with my environmental, you know, we really look at, you know, myths and misconceptions about climate and climate change, and, you know, and start from there. And I don't necessarily go into the breadth that I would with a politics class, just because of the implication that it has there in different ways. So to new teachers, I would say figure out the scope for the class that you want, and it's okay to do some parts of it as well, and do it in, you know, sometimes for me it depends on the class, and again in online learning it looks a little different, but it's okay to do some of it and then come back to it again later, and then come back to it again. And I think that in some ways for students, sort of memory or their application, it's better in some ways to introduce a skill, use that skill over time, then, you know, a couple months later introduce a new skill, and it doesn't have to be all done at once.
So you sort of space some of these things out throughout a whole semester or a whole curriculum.
Yeah, you know, even with the reading like a historian curriculum, you know, I start with sourcing, and we practice that for a long time before we really get into what it means to close read something. Just because, you know, again, you know, we're humans, we just start reading something, we really don't grasp what that source is. And I think the same thing with civic online reasoning, you really have to practice these skills in chunks over and over again in order to be able to use them.
Well, Valerie, this has been enormously helpful. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, you're welcome.